Howdy, folks. Welcome to Redneck Gone Green. I'm your host, David Cobb. I am the redneck, and you bet I've gone green, and I'm trying to get you to do it too. And as a reminder, as we always do on this show every week, to remind you that when we say go green, we're not just talking about environmentalism. We're talking about something deeper, the interconnectedness of all of life. And whether you come at that from a deep eco-spiritual feminist perspective, or you come at that from a hard science rational perspective, or like me, you say those are both completely valid ways of understanding the world. Let me say it like this, y'all. All of life is interconnected in a web, and whatever we do to that web, we are ultimately doing to ourselves. And straight up, we doing it wrong. We are literally destroying Mother Earth faster than she can replenish herself, and we have a very short and closing window to do something about it. And with that, let's bring our good pal Shane Knight into the conversation. Shane, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing pretty well, as you can see. I'm not living half bad. Speaking of ecological consideration and care, I'm actually in Woodstock, New York, where that's taken fairly seriously.
Of course, Woodstock is literally like you were literally just miles from the spot of that great concert for peace and love, aren't you?
I am. It's right down the road and all over the place. We've been here since Saturday evening, and this is my first time up here. And the community up here is really close knit, and they seem to, exude a sense of community like I wish so many other places did, especially politically. But it's been fascinating.
I've had the privilege of being up there on a number of occasions, and it goes way beyond the tie-dye, doesn't it? I mean, you really have, there is a political and cultural rootedness to that place that is sorely missing in most parts of the U.S.
Yeah, I think and for me too, it's a lovely, it's an inspiration, really, because you can see it everywhere you go, and there are even nods to indigenous ways of life that are sustained up here, and it's quite an interesting spot. I can see why they migrated all the way out here to hold a show that is one for the ages.
It really is. And of course, the Back to the Land hippies from New York City went up to Woodstock. As y'all know, I live in Humboldt County, California, where the Back to the Land hippies from San Francisco were. So I feel a certain kinship. And Shane, when you talk about a place that is rooted in culture, exudes something special, boy, you've really set up our guests for today. We are joined by, in keeping with the continued Irish deep dive, we are joined by two co-founders of Móna, who are doing grassroots resilience and building community power in West Belfast. These two fellas are building something not only powerful but beautiful in the very heart of the struggle. Glorona is an Irish language and cultural center, but it's also a whole lot more. So I also want to acknowledge that I consider Ciarán and Feargal not only inspirations and comrades, but actually cherished friends who I've gotten to know over the last couple of years. And I can't wait to introduce them to y'all, the Redneck Gone Green audience. So let me give them a proper introduction, starting with Feargal Ionnrachtaigh, or Ionnrachtaigh. Feargal is a community activist, a writer, co-founder of Glorona. He's been deeply involved in the Irish language revival movement and has been creating spaces where working class youth connect with their own culture, politics, and solidarity. His book, Language, Resistance, and Revival, explores how the Irish language has been a tool of both struggle and empowerment in Belfast and the entirety of the north of Ireland. Feargal, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, David. Pleasure to be here.
But wait, y'all, there's more. We're also joined by Ciarán McGillivine. Ciarán is an Irish language activist, educator, and another co-founder of Glorona. He's played a leading role in campaigns for Irish language rights and expanding access to community-based education. His work focuses on both building cultural pride, social justice, grassroots leadership, and y'all straighten up and act right, because he's the current president of the entire Irish Language Association and Alliance for the entirety of Ireland. Ciarán, welcome to the program.
David, many thanks. Thank you for having me.
Look here, y'all. I want to jump right into it. For folks who were with us last week, they heard Feargal McLaughlin, who y'all introduced me and Kali Akuno to, who just did a phenomenal job of setting context for it. But some of the folks who were with us this week may not have heard that. So we're going to actually start with a little bit of historical grounding and setting the stage for Belfast itself. Speaking of a place that is rooted in both struggle but also empowerment, I want to kick it over to the two of you to sort of set a little bit of historical context for us.
Well, just in terms of where Feargal had left off, obviously Feargal is a very dear comrade of ours, and we would say, is probably the foremost authority on the history of republicanism in Ireland. So it was great that you were able to revel in his knowledge that he shared with you last week. From our perspective, Belfast and that which is commonly known as a city within the 6-county statelet known as Northern Ireland. Feargal obviously talked about Northern Ireland last week and how it was set up. The long jury brings us to the partition of Ireland in 1920, where after a period of resistance and revolutionary struggle, the British government enacted a treaty that divided the Irish country, but at the same time created a civil war in Ireland, where the Republican movement at that time split between those who agreed with the treaty and signed a treaty with the British Empire and those who opposed that treaty. And
but Feargal, before you go any further, you've said something very powerful that I want to underscore. The British Empire created that civil war. I do not want to mince any words at all. That civil war was not Irishmen who couldn't figure out how to get along. That civil war was a direct function of colonization. It was imposed on the Irish people by an illegitimate, immoral, unethical empire. Sorry for the interruption, Feargal, but I just want my audience to really understand what that context is.
Just to even unpack that slightly further, in 1918, there was a general election where the main revolutionary party at that time, Sinn Féin, won a majority of seats. So the island of Ireland voted en masse for independence in 1918. The British government responded to that by imposing martial law and arresting most of those people who'd just been democratically elected. So that was democracy, British Empire style. And again, as I mentioned, that would bring us, there would be a 2-year military conflict, and then Ireland would be partitioned. And there was a treaty that was to fortify that agreement. But what the British government did, and Feargal talked about this last week, is they created a 6-county state in the north of Ireland, which was called Northern Ireland, that would have a permanent inbuilt unionist majority. Feargal again talked about the plantation of Ulster 400 years ago. It would create a permanent unionist majority, and it would be based on fundamentally on a discriminatory state, and it would be based on gerrymandered electoral boundaries. So it would be created in such a way as to systemically create a country that would discriminate against the nationalist Republican minority. So that was the state that myself and Ciarán were born into in 1981 and 82 respectively. And we were born in a community in open rebellion against this Orange state. So the South African apartheid regime would later say that it would give one of their famous ministers, Ciarán might remember his name, said that he would give it his right arm for one clause of the Special Powers Act. But the Special Powers Act was draconian legislation where the unionist regime could arrest people and imprison them without trial. And it was used in every decade of the 20th century, from the 20s up until the late 60s, when we had the civil rights movement, which was borrowing its inspiration from the black civil rights movement in the US, challenged that discriminatory legislation, and the clarion call of that civil rights movement was one man, one vote, because at that stage the housing allocation and the voting allocation was tied into how the housing structures were I suppose corruptly manifested. So what you had in terms of the voting system, whereby if you never owned a house, you didn't have a vote. So in some cases, you would have had people from the Protestant Unionist majority who may have had 10 or 12 homes. They had that allocation of votes. People from the Nationalist Republican minority who had no house had no vote whatsoever. So that was one of the clarion calls of that civil rights movement.
Feargal, thank you so much, because once again, as you comrades from Glór and Móna do every single time I talk to you, the clarity around class and the class struggle and the class nature of this empire and of that, frankly, invasion that has been going on for centuries is clear and unequivocal. Ciarán, I want to bring you into the conversation as well. Anything to add in terms of sort of the context setting? I want to invite you.
Yeah. And I'm just, again, I watched with great interest your show last week with Dr. Feargal McCluskey, and I know that he was trying to cover kind of 800 years of Irish history in an hour-long podcast. He did, in Feargal's stay, he did a very impressive job of doing that, but I suppose he didn't have the opportunity to dig in deep in terms of the particular cultural aspect, which has been the focus of what Glór and Móna have been about. And Feargal mentioned the fact that you were born into a state that was an open rebellion, a state that was falling apart at the seams in many respects. When the Northern State was created, I suppose, again, in keeping with colonial practice up until then, whereby the language, the indigenous language and culture of Ireland was the chief target of British colonialism. And this is very much rooted in this is forms component parts of the education programs that we deliver with young people here in particular. It was based on the understanding that you can never truly occupy a country, you can never truly control a country unless you control the mental universe of the people that live there. And I mean, this is evidenced in people like Edmund Spencer, who was an emissary to Queen Elizabeth I, who was the first really queen to conquest Ireland in any meaningful way from England. And he had a conversation. This took the form of a book. It's captured really impressively by the African writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He describes what took place. But essentially what happened was they asked, why were the English failing to conquer Ireland? What was preventing them from doing so? And Edmund Spencer and this other guy who he's writing back and forth with, and this forms the basis of this book, decided that there were two things that they needed to do. They needed to change the naming structure. So Irish people have very ancient genealogical roots that go right back, and you trace our naming structures right back many thousands of years. You need to change that, and most importantly, you need to destroy the language. And if you do both those things, the people will soon forget who they are. Now, you had maybe 400 years later, you had the Black Consciousness and ANC liberation fighter Steve Biko saying essentially the same thing, that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the means of the oppressed. So the cultural aspect of what took place in the revolutionary period in the late 1930s, 20th century was incredibly important, because when that started, the historian Brian Whelan talked about the kind of cultural revival being the cultural response to the Irish famine or the Irish Holocaust, which took place in the middle of the 19th century. And it was phenomenally successful. And it put huge and enormous pressure on the state and actually gained traction. So some of the things that the activists that have been lobbying for at that stage, they achieved for the first time in the history of, since Britain became involved in Ireland. Suddenly Irish was being taught to some level in schools. There was increasing recognition of this. After partition in the northern state, all of that was reversed. Essentially, it became illegal again to consider yourself being Irish. The Irish language was driven underground. Activists were arrested in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, right through for having the temerity to erect bilingual signs, Irish language signs, and being an Irish speaker and organising on that basis became a subversive act. And yet, thankfully, many people continued to do that, because essentially what that did was it exposed and it put the mirror up to the face of British imperialism. So the portrayal of Ireland as being a normal state, an emergent state and all of that, when you added the language and the cultural aspect to that, why is the indigenous language of the country being persecuted, being denied any type of visibility, being denied any type of support? The whole facade of the state started to unravel. And we're seeing the exact same thing right up until the present day. David, we've had a long running campaign for language rights here, for increased visibility, increased funding for the Irish language, in line with what we'd be entitled to, in line with what happens with other minoritized languages across Europe, for instance. And this is a real sore point in our political structures here. Some of the most dominant parties in the north are openly hostile to any idea of giving anything to the Irish language, particularly rates-based frameworks or approaches or anything like that. So this is a long history of cultural oppression, and I think that the work that we do in terms of Glór and Móna to bring it into where we are today is around trying to continue in that culture of using language as a means of rebuilding communities and a means of bringing people back in to expose the broader kind of dynamics of imperialism and colonialism in Ireland.
You know, you both of you lads just I love how you break it down without dumbing it down, right? Like you speak plainly, simply, and powerfully. There are a couple of things that I want to really lift up. One, you know, you are both very modest, but I know, you know, you say casually that you were born into struggle. But the reality is, you are the sons, you are the grandsons, you are the nephews. You are literally the living legacy of people who fought, who did not give up, who did not surrender. And you both have very powerful personal stories. I don't want to force a conversation, but you know, Feargal, I've read your book. You know, so I know a bit about the personal story. I've had a chance to meet your brother. I've had a chance to go to that field where you lads played as boys, and I'm tearing up now just because I know both of your stories. And I want to give you a chance to share just a taste of that story to make it personal. Because I'll just say, I graduated high school in 1981. Part of my consciousness began during the hunger strikers. Like, I did not know, right? But that began a process for me. Y'all were born into that. And I do, again, want to give you a chance to get a little personal for both of you. We'll start with you, Feargal.
No problem. And again, just to follow in on the context of us being born in struggle, like we have argued that the Unionist state, the Orange State as it was called, was Europe's first fascist state. So before we had the black shirts in Italy, and before we had the brown shirts in Nazi Germany, we had what Lloyd George, who set it up, described it as a little Jewish Ulster, is what he called it. So just what they did with Israel, they were doing the same thing here. They were fortifying themselves with a military enclave of a state which was the most heavily armed, heavily fortified state in Europe at that time. So our parents and grandparents were born into the struggle. So for my own personal background, my father was somebody who learned union organizing as a baker. He was interned without trial in 1973. So he was the last cohort to be interned. The British government had used internment in every decade, very successfully, to quell the different Republican uprisings. The difference being in 1871, between 1871 and 1874, at that period of time, the six countries en masse was in an open insurrection against the British government. The Orange State had collapsed. The British government had then been sent in their army to shore up their imperial interests in the northern state. And the internment process had ultimately failed. But what happened to my father was, when he was in jail, he learned Irish while he was in prison. Yeah, he had the opportunity to learn Irish, where it was being taught as a means of resistance during incarceration. And when he came out of prison, he was more politicized than he was before he went in. And then he became an activist in the movement for change in Ireland. And then my mother, in that period of time, was also involved in setting up what became known as the Relative Action Committees, which was basically parents, mothers, activists whose children were incarcerated during what became known as the H-Block struggle, where prisoners would be incarcerated in a new prison that would be forced to wear a prison uniform for Republican prisoners was something that they obviously opposed. They then embarked on what became known as the blanket protest or the no wash protest, where they were thrown into their cells naked, refused to wear the prison uniform, wrapped themselves in a blanket, and became the blanket men. They were being brutalized, leaving the cells to slap out in the morning. So eventually they stayed in their cells 24 hours a day and smeared their excrement on the wall to nullify its smell. However, they kept a small block at the bottom of the cell, free of excrement, where they would inscribe their Irish language classes in the evening when the screws with the prison wars had left the wing. So the language was always a means of struggle. And my mother was involved in the people's movement that was set up on behalf of the prisoners. She was also involved in the feminist movement. They had set up the Falls Women's Centre in the 80s, which was to support women who were suffering domestic abuse during the conflict. So that was my background coming through that. Born in 1981, it was one of the most tumultuous, bloodiest years of the conflict. And it was also paradoxically a year where the biggest mass movement had been built in Ireland since the 1960s and 70s, which was the anti-hate movement. So it was very much a community in struggle, a community in interaction and an uprising. Myself and Ciarán both attended the Irish language school at that time, Bunscough First, which was the only school of its kind in the north of Ireland, which had been a head school for refused funding for 13 years. It was independent of the church and independent of the state. So myself and Ciarán both attended that school, and then across Belfast, Republican prisoners who had just been released from incarceration began to set up their own nursery or kindergarten schools through the medium of Irish across the city. And this movement was a movement for decolonisation. It was linking the language, it was linking national self-determination and this idea of liberatory decolonisation through the praxis of community activism. So that's what was happening in our communities. Later on, when I was doing my A levels, my oldest brother Terry and who was also a community youth worker, who again I was the youngest of four, so I'm the only person who had a chance to attend the Irish school. The Irish school wasn't available, but the other three. In 1988, Terry was also working as a doorman, a bouncer in a nightclub in town, and he was shot dead by loyalist gunmen. Now, just about that, a wee bit of context throughout, and Ciarán can speak to this as well, but because he also lost his uncle.
So sadly, Feargal we've lost the connection, Ciarán. So I'm gonna pass it to you.
Lose me there?
Yeah, you froze for a moment.
Yeah, it just froze up for a second.
Just as you were talking. Yeah, you're back. So you were talking about losing Terry.
Yes,
and how Ciarán had also lost his uncle. That's where
I mentioned about his uncle. I was mentioning about his uncle, and I think his father, Colin, that maybe tuning in here, he's been fighting the long-term campaign on behalf of his brother Pat, who was killed in the 70s. However, the reason I was talking about this was the policy, just to tie it up with the wider imperial strategy. The British government policy was a policy of collusion, where they had set up all these loyalist gangs. So that there was a famous British Army general called Frank Kitson, who had practiced this in Kenya and all over Africa, and he wrote a book called Counter Gangs, how the settler colonial majority would be used and infiltrated and funded to create armed groups and armed gangs and carry out the empire. So Terry was killed by two loyalist agents, the people who worked for the British state, were paid by the British state, and they were and he was killed during a period leading up to the Good Friday Agreement, where what the British government was trying to do was trying to ensure that the Republican movement accepted the Good Friday Agreement, which was considered to be less than they had fought for. And the idea was to turn the screw on the Republican movement in the lead up to the Good Friday Agreement to ensure that they accepted the new peace agreement. So it was a policy of intimidation, murder, and coercion, but it was the same policy that the British government had been using from the 1970s. So there was never a case where a Catholic or a nationalist or a Republican was randomly killed by a loyalist in a sectarian murder. All these so-called sectarian murders were planned assassinations that were funded and organized by the British state. So that was our experience of the conflict here. And Terry was only one of thousands of others who suffered the same fate. I suppose in terms of my own activism, the impact of Terry's death and the huge outpouring of community solidarity and grief thereafter was a motivating factor in our continued adherence to these different tenets of struggle, which we're still facilitating and we're still implementing this day. And this is one of the reasons when people ask me about this, David, I would never speak about these loyalists who were involved in the killing were patsies, were pawns of the British state. So when we talk about where we should focus our opposition, where we should focus our anger, where we should focus our activism, it's always on the structure of British imperialism and British capitalism in Ireland, which was a structure that created, paid for, and organised and orchestrated campaigns of murder like this.
And Feargal, I got to say, what is ringing in my ear is Amical Cabral, who taught us theory is a weapon. And your clarity and understanding about the systems, the structures, and why and how your brother was murdered and thousands of others, I appreciate deeply. And thank you for telling the story, which I know cannot be an easy one to do. Ciarán, I want to shift to you and give you the same opportunity to personalize it a bit, because again, you are now the president of the Irish Language Association. I won't butcher it, so I'll give you a chance to talk about that a little bit. But the story of how people were gathering and have for centuries gathered to speak Irish and teach the Irish language to one another in direct violation of the law of the colonizer, to me, is nothing short of inspirational. I mean, I like every time I read the story, and like so many others, I descend from Irish folk who were driven off of homelands. I am just filled with both a sense of anger, righteous indignation, but also pride about the fact that we're still here.
Yeah, 100%, and that was evidenced in the national rally that we held on Saturday, David. We had 25,000 people on the streets of Dublin.
Amazing.
And
Say that number again, because I wish that we had some video of that. Say that number again slowly.
Yeah, we happily share the video, and you guys can share it from your feeds and stuff. But we had around 25,000 people on the streets of Dublin. We marched down O'Connell Street. O'Connell Street, for anyone who's familiar with Dublin, it's the main kind of street in Dublin. It's where the DPO, famous site of the 1916, where the leaders of the 1916 uprising were stationed. So it's an incredibly significant, historically significant site and street in Irish history and stuff. And we'd marched down there, and we have an amazing drone footage where it's a sea. The color of our campaign is similar to one of the colors that you reference here, red. So we all wear red t-shirts. And you just see a sea of red occupying the entirety of O'Connell Street, which is a very long and broad street. So it was the first time that we've had a national rally in Dublin in 11 years. And we know that we've done kind of really big rallies in recent years in Belfast, and we're pretty confident about mobilising the community here in Belfast. With Dublin, it was a bit of unknown territory for us, but it was incredibly important. It was incredibly important for a number of reasons. Primarily, we wanted to send a strong message to the Irish government. We keep hearing these kind of politicians coming out talking about the fact that the Irish government has never been as rich because of the kind of low corporation tax. They're getting all these mostly American multinational corporations in, and they reluctantly had to take a tax bill off Apple. And last year there, to the tune of billions. So they're kind of flush with cash, but there never seems to be enough for the Irish language communities. We have Gaeltacht communities in the west of Ireland, historically and contemporaneously the poorest areas of Ireland. Also some of the most picturesque at places like West Kerry, South Kerry, in the Connemara and Galway, up at the Donegal and Mayo, where people have been abandoned by the state in many respects, that generation after generation of young people had no other option but to immigrate. And it's incredibly difficult for those people and for a language community, and these are native language communities. These are communities that have been speaking Irish continuously for thousands of years. They aren't like ourselves, maybe in the east of Ireland here, where we're second language learners. Essentially, we learned Irish through our education system that Feargal talked about earlier. So those communities are incredibly important in terms of our language, our overall language project, and they've been decimated. And the government has done very little to, I suppose, to stop that tide decimation. We were out there to protest around the Irish language, but also the point that you made, David, was incredibly important. We had a strong political message. We had a strong kind of powerful message around protest and what our political demands were, but also it was equally, it was a march of celebration, because in spite, we've been fighting for recognition, we've been fighting for dignity, and we've been fighting for respect in our own country for hundreds of years in the face of brutal occupation and colonization, which again, as I mentioned, both in word and deed, targeted the Irish language specifically during that process. So the fact that we have survived, and in fact we're now thriving, is an absolute miracle, and we can never lose sight of that. And I think, you know, we've suffered under, you know, 800 years of colonization in Ireland. During that period, we've had the Statutes of Kilkenny, we've had the penal laws, we've had some of the most draconian pieces of legislation which have tried to marginalise Irish, push it to the margins, push it to extinction, and many other languages have died in that period, but Irish has survived, and it's something that we should be incredibly proud of. But pride isn't enough. We need to build on that. We need to see what we're going to do in the future. And I think for us, it isn't just about language for language's sake. The stuff that Feargal had talked about earlier there, you know, we're aware of some of the challenges that face us nationally and also globally. And what we view the language is the language as a means of building communities. It's a means of building networks of people who have an interest in kind of offering something deeper and better for their own communities. And that's the kind of, it's our more organising model. I know the Feargal, for instance, in last week's programme, the other Feargal McCluskey, had talked about kind of James Connolly, the importance of James Connolly and his thinking in early 20th century Irish history. And he recognised that the cause of Labour needed to be found an inroad with a broader ideological framework, which was Irish republicanism, to be successful. And I think for us, the language is that broader ideological framework. The language is incredibly important. We want to maintain the language, but it also offers us an avenue to organise. It offers us an avenue to rebuild. It offers us an avenue to bring young people through, to educate, to mobilise, to agitate around the issue of language. And that is incredibly important in these times where neoliberalism has tried to push us to become these kind of detached, atomized individuals. The Thatcher idea that society is dead, that everyone lives and is motivated purely by their own self-interest and stuff. The fact that tonight, Glór and Móna just started our classes, we have, you know, around 80 people from working class backgrounds that are going to sit in their classes to try and learn the Irish language as a second learner, even though they won't accrue any personal, you know, remuneration out of this. This is something that they're doing out of something deeper, something that means something more. And I think that that's a lesson for us all, not just in Ireland, but people who are interested in bringing about progressive change around the world, is finding what is that HCMI community? How can we use something to mobilise people to work together towards a brighter future? And for us, the language is that thread.
Folks,
I love that idea. Sorry.
No, hit it. Go, Shane.
No, I love the idea. The first time I heard how you guys were taking a cultural topic and weaving into it a political narrative and using it essentially as a tool, I was blown away. And I want to hear more about the success, but David's got to give let people know what they're doing.
I got to remind folks that you are watching and or listening to Redneck Gone Green. I'm your host, David Cobb, joined as always by co-host Shane Knight. Today, we are talking to Feargal and Ciarán. These are two lads from Belfast who come and born out of struggle, but also celebration. They are co-founders of Glorona, a Irish language cultural center, political organizing and education center in West Belfast. I've had the privilege of actually going there, hosted by these folks. I got to tell you, that Irish hospitality is real. As a Southerner, I take hospitality seriously. Y'all give us a run for the money, man. The way you've made me feel to home, but also I really want to underscore the political clarity that it's inseparable. Your political work from your cultural work, from your language work. So I want y'all to also now take a moment, because you're two co-founders of Glorona, right? Like this is, I want to give you and encourage you to describe to our audience just what Glór na Móna is, both as an idea, but also as a physical space. You're muted, brother.
Yeah, you're on mute, Feargal.
There we go.
I've just seen some of the comments coming in that just interested about this idea of the pitfalls of nationalism and how some.
So I don't know about y'all, but I am having a hard time hearing our comrade. Shane, you have
Yeah,
no
I was looking
problem?
into that. Yeah, let's see.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's really echoey, like you're underwater. Maybe.
I don't know what has happened here, but something has gone on. Ciarán, can you pick it up and while he plays with his settings?
Go ahead, Ciarán.
Yeah, definitely. So, you know, as Feargal mentioned, we both attended Irish medium schools here in West Belfast. So when our schools were the first school that myself and Feargal both attended, Bunschool Football First, it was established in 1971. It came as a result of a number of young kind of radical activists who built their own houses in the outskirts of what was then the outskirts of West Belfast, wanted to live their lives entirely through Irish. And then they says, well, you know, suddenly after a while they had some children. And they said, we need to educate these kids through Irish. So they wrote to the Department of Education, outlined their intentions. The Department of Education at the time in 1969 replied with a letter which now is in the archive, the school archive, that not only are you allowed to do that, but if you do that, you'll be arrested and imprisoned. But thankfully, they didn't take the threat, and they went ahead and they established the school anyway. Originally, what that was for was solely for the purpose of the children from that very small community. But later on in the 1970s, and I suppose as a result of the broader political context, because by that stage the conflict was in full flow, British oppression and occupation was becoming much more visceral and you know, felt within our communities, and then it was decided to open up the school to children like myself. So we came from working class backgrounds. Our parents didn't have any Irish themselves, apart from the small bits that they maybe learned while they were in prison and stuff. So the school we were allowed to attend that school. Then we went on to post-primary school. Again, a similar experience. The school was denied funding. The issue of the school then, this was in the early 1990s, it became a key political issue during the early days of the peace process. The principal at the time, Fergus O'Hare, was a stalwart of the civil rights movement, was a very keen and astute political actor and kind of organizer, and was able to strategically kind of locate the question of recognition of the school within the broader peace process, and essentially ask the question, how sincere can the British government be about peace in Ireland if they can't even recognise this school solely on the basis that they're educating children through Irish? That was a very successful campaign. But during this period, myself and Feargal and many others like us, we saw the sacrifices that people were making for our own behalf. Teachers were leaving schools where they had permanent positions, they had secure pensions, they had all those benefits that come rightly so with that profession. They were leaving it to come down and work in a school where their wage was determined by the ability of our parents to fundraise that month, and that fluctuated. We saw our parents going out in the evenings to fundraise around the bars and the clubs of West Belfast. Our parents would have been in painting the school, and many other people rallied behind. Many other members of the community rallied behind the school. So when then we went through that system, we then went on. We would have been the first within our families to go to third level institutions, to get a degree. We went to Queen's University in Belfast, and then we were saying, well, you know, what are we going to do? And there was a sense of a moral obligation of giving something back. But because we had been through the education system, we understood that you need to have something beyond the education system. If the language and the language community remains rooted within a school system, then you're going to constantly go around what social linguists talk about, a kind of roundabout, where the community doesn't grow. You know, I learn Irish through school, but I don't use Irish outside of school. I have a really positive experience. I then send my own children to that, and on and on and on, but you don't go beyond that. What we were thinking about was at the time of political organising, using the language as a means of, as I say, as a model of political organising, and also providing more people within the community with opportunities to use and socialise and live their lives through Irish. So when we established Glór na Móna in 2004, it was about adult education. It was about, over time, then it kind of became more focused on providing young people with opportunities to use the language outside of school, and also to gain a sense of education and agency through that process. So many of the young people then, they were particularly in the early days of Glór and Móna, there was no idea of Irish medium youth work per se. It was a new concept. So they were fighting for recognition within a new realm. They were saying they were the first people to go through this process, and they had to agitate and organize and campaign for their own rights. And through that process, a lot of the young people that come through Glór and Móna. Glór and Móna is one of a network of a number, like scores and scores and scores of similar Irish language community-based organisations that are located throughout the island of Ireland. I suppose what Glór and Móna is most famous for is our ability to mobilise numbers, but also to, I suppose, bring through highly educated, highly motivated young people, young leaders. And they've been through this process primarily as a result of the youth work that Glór and Móna do. And that has been around political education, but also centering the young people in the campaigns for their own rights. So not advocating on behalf of young people, but letting young people advocate on their own behalf. So through that period, we've had a number of cuts to our services. We've had funding removed. We've had, numerous kind of setbacks, but we didn't see them as setbacks. We saw them as opportunities. We're saying this gives us, so when they're threatening to close our youth club, taking the funding away, taking the 4 youth workers that work away and closing the youth club for 160 young people, going, this is an opportunity to bring a new generation of young people through the political education of why that decision, how can a decision like this be made, and what can we do about it? The important question, what can we do about it? We don't need to wait till the next election to try and vote in a more sympathetic politician. There's shit that we can do right now to change this, and it's about mobile. And you want young people to see that, but most importantly, once they see that this can actually have an effect, i.e. overturn the decision, getting more money into the youth club, and they say, well, if we can do that, what else can we do here? There's no fucking limit to what we can do. So a lot of the young people that would have been involved in those early Glór and Móna campaigns around youth work, they became the leaders of the broader Irish language rights movement. And they had the experience of organising, but they also had the experience of succeeding. Well, we've done this before. We know we can do it again. So they were the ones that were out addressing the rallies. They were the ones that were travelling around schools, mobilising the next generation of young people that are in our Irish medium primary schools here. And they're the generation that are raising expectation bars all the time in terms of what they view and what their expectations are of the state and how the state deals with them. And that's what's really, really exciting about where we are right now in terms of Glór and Móna's trajectory, because I suppose myself and Feargal came through at a time where the language didn't really exist outside of school. So if you heard someone speaking Irish in the city centre, if you saw some piece of Irish up on the wall, it was unique and new. Young people now are more used to that, so their expectations are much greater. So if the state thought that they had a problem with us, they don't fucking know anything. Because these young people that have come through, they're going to push it right, much, much further.
Well, I hope, Feargal, let's give it a shot and see if we've got your audio fixed. I'm afraid not.
It's get worse.
It's worse. I don't know what the hell is going on, and it's a shame. I will say this, Feargal, you can play with it a little bit on your end again, but Ciarán and Feargal, you've heard me say it before. I've had the privilege of meeting some of the young folk that y'all are rolling with, and they understand the assignment. I have rarely seen the level of clarity, not just dedication, but true commitment. These folks are not to be denied. We're going to have both Emer and Owen on next week to continue, the next generation, if you will, to talk about this. And Feargal, we're going to try one more time to see if you're able to join us. I'm not sure. It could well be that the authorities don't want your voice heard. That could certainly be it. Let's give you another try, Feargal, and see if you're able to join the conversation.
Well, yeah, I was going to see if he could just leave and then rejoin to the same link. That may do the trick.
Give that a shot, Feargal. So shut yourself down and just come back.
Yeah, there you go.
So, Ciarán, while we wait for our comrade to come back, I want to give you a chance. Talk about Glór na Móna, the physical infrastructure, not only what you've already built, but what the plans are. Because, I've had a chance to actually walk those grounds. I was in a remembrance march. It was an honor to do so. To the best of your ability, paint that picture for the viewers and listeners of Redneck Gone Green about what is actually happening there in West Belfast on the ground.
Yeah, well, so Glór na Móna was established, as is mentioned, in 2004. At that time, we had no real home per se. We had no space. We were given small space by a local Irish medium primary school, who showed a lot of generosity at the time, helped us get the project off the ground and stuff. But that was never going to be a long-term viable option. From there, we then rented a space off a private landlord for extortionate rates, which wasn't suitable in any way, but there was something really unique and special about this place because it didn't have fire exit. It had no natural light coming in, but the young people, they were the first generation of young people to go to the centre. They felt this enormous sense of kind of ownership over the space, and all the way we were had our eye out when we need something more secure for the future. And around 2013-14, we became aware of a site which, for a number of reasons, was incredibly important. There's a strip of land here off the White Rock Road in West Belfast, in White Rock Close, and it was the site of the Ballymurphy Tenants Association. The Ballymurphy Tenants Association was the first building of its kind anywhere. It was set up and built by people like Sean Mackall, Frank Cahill, and others, who saw that the people of Ballymurphy, who had very little to nothing, they were heavily discriminated against, heavily militarized. They needed somewhere to go and let off some steam. They needed somewhere to get together as a community. And they built the Ballymurphy Tenants Association on the site. That then moved on a number of years later. The same place, the same location, then became the home to the local Irish medium primary school, again, when it was in porta cabins and trailers, as you guys call them. And this is before it got any funding or recognition from the state. This was set up by community activists, ordinary people from Ballymurphy who established this Irish medium primary school. And again, when that school then got funding and recognition, it moved down to a proper building within Ballymurphy itself. So that space was lying empty. It had this huge kind of history of community activism, of Irish language in it. We said, that's the spot. We got some funding, we were able to build a building, but immediately, David, it became clear to us that the building itself was too small. The young people were swinging from the roofs; it couldn't house them. So we almost within a year or two, we were kind of looking at, we need to expand, we need a new building, we need a bigger building and stuff. And what's happened in recent years, that's really been crystallized through our conversations and the relationship we've developed with our comrades in the PNLL, and the emphasis you guys place on ownership and the idea of land and who owns land and securing that tenure of land and stuff, and then the potential to use that, to leverage that, to then build and develop even further, is something that's really pushed us to kind of up our game and to make sure that we build something that is fit for purpose for the next 50 to 100 years, that the young people and the people at Ballymurphy and the Upper Springfield area and West Belfast in general will see as a resource and a hub for activity, somewhere where they can go when they have the same sense of ownership. It's important to stress in all this as well that we are building on the shoulders of giants, the people that have came before us, who did so in much harsher times than those times that we're operating in at the minute in Belfast. People like our building is named after Sean Mackall. I think we may have shared the story with you, David, when you were here. Sean Mackall was someone from this area. He grew up in a Republican family. He was the only real Irish-speaking family in the area at the time. This would have been during the 1940s and the 50s. He went on to become an architect, but never forgot the community from where he came. He built the Ballymurphy Tenants Association, as I mentioned there, and he had also set up a number of workers' cooperatives here in West Belfast and in Ballymurphy. So again, at a time in the late 60s, early 70s, unemployment was rife. People here couldn't get employment. They set up a cooperative. That was one of the biggest employers in this area at the time. when Operation Motorman, which was the British military kind of occupation in the north, when that kind of got under full swing, his site was demolished, burnt to the ground, and the British Army built one of the biggest military fortresses in Belfast on that site. It was called Fort Jericho at that time. There was nothing he could do about that. He challenged this decision. There was told Ministry of Defence law, there's nothing you can do. But in 1998, the Good Friday Agreement was signed, and as part of that, the British government committed to demilitarisation, what they called, so kind of removing all the heavily fortified barracks that they built up in areas like West Belfast. And that was demolished at the time. Fort Jericho, that was removed. And at that point in time, Sean McGill, who we named our building after, was given a cheque for rent that had accrued over the previous 30 years. Now, anyone of lesser morals would have just said, you know what, I'm going to live the rest of my life out in Barbados or some tropical island. But Sean McGill decided to give this money to a nursery school in Ballymurphy, an Irish medium nursery school in Ballymurphy, and an Irish nursery school in Downpatrick. So we named the building after him at the time. We're very proud that the building's named after him. But the reason I told that story, that's the people that we come from. That's the history that we have. So we have this tubber, as we would say in Irish, or well in English, from which to draw, in which there is this really rich history of sacrifice, of community activism, of doing something beyond just what's in your own personal interest, of proving the Thatcher's maxim that we're all motivated by self-interest, proving every day that that's a lie, building society, building communities up from the bottom up. We have so many inspirational people from within our community to draw from, that what we're doing is just continuation of what has been happening in this country for so long. And it's a privilege to be able to give our contribution to that.
Yeah, there's a special place in hell for Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, the lot of them, right? So, Feargal, I see that you're back. We're going to try one more time, and I hope we can get your voice back into the conversation.
Oh no!
Not. It's just even worse.
You're going to have to get Feargal back for his own show after this.
Yeah. I'm going to do that. So, Feargal, I'll make a promise to you. We're going to bring you back, Ciarán. We're gonna we're running out of time, so I do want to give a shot to really you've touched on it, but I want to lift up and give you a chance to really describe some of the parallels between Belfast now and the struggles that we're going under. Of course, we're going to be doing a session with y'all and Trademark and others for lessons learned. But what can U.S. leftists and solidarity economy folks learn from y'all? You know, you've been really generous talking about some of the things that you picked up from us, but we're learning from each other. This is a true collaborative experience, and I'm going to invite you to help us think through with the Redneck Gone Green audience this idea of joyful resistance. Like, I really want to, I wish that I could take others and have them live what I went through, just going through the streets of Belfast, going to the Glór and the Móna events, the intergenerational nature of y'all all coming together. I mean, I rarely have seen like so many toddlers, young people, like, children, teenagers, adults, older adults, true elders, all in one space as I did at Glór and the Móna for your political event. So, like, let's. It really does seem like it's Irish language and it's the politics. You do not separate them.
Yeah, that's it. And I suppose, as you were talking there, David, I was reminded of we had talked about Shaw's Gaeltacht, and they were young working class people who built their own houses based on their own skills, and they did this in the 1960s. And in 1969, obviously the conflict started in the north of Ireland, or the latest iteration of the conflict, if you like, started in the north of Ireland. That time there were a number of pogroms carried out, particularly across Belfast, particularly within the Catholic communities across Belfast. Thousands of Catholics were burnt from the home. My own mother included during that period was burnt from home in North Belfast. And one of the areas that became synonymous with that was Bombay Street in the Lower Falls, when loyalist mobs, aided and abetted by the state, came in and burnt a number of streets down, including Bombay Street. You had these young activists and further out in West Belfast who had just built their homes, And what they did was they used the skills that they had accrued, and they went down and rebuilt Bombay Street, because Belfast City Council, or Belfast Corporation, as it was known then, refused to do so. And they did that. The activists, the Irish language activists in Shaw's Road, did that in the understanding, as what they described it at the time, that they couldn't live in splendid isolation from what was happening around them. And I think what the lessons for us is, as activists, as people who want to see progressive change, be it through Glorona, Móna and Irish language activism, or be it through the PNLL, we can't become live in silos where we're talking to ourselves about our own issues. We need to look at what the issues that are affecting ordinary people and try and find remedies to them. We had a conversation with your colleague Eva Keaton about this earlier, David. We look at some of the issues that are facing people in West Belfast. We're facing increasing issues around food poverty. We're facing issues around homelessness. We're facing issues around a rise in racism and a rise of kind of fascist tendencies within very small numbers. Thankfully, they're being challenged. But that's the type of stuff that we need to be organising around. We can't just stay focused on Irish language and youth activities and stuff. We need to meet the challenges as they emerge, and we need to provide people with remedies. And people's biggest issues is, I don't have enough food in my fridge to feed my kids. Then our biggest priority is, how do we get enough food in her fridge?
That's exactly right. Objective material needs, right? I am a proud and unapologetic socialist as well. And if we are not meeting objective material needs, then we ain't doing it right.
Yeah.
Ciarán, we're coming to the end of the program. I do want to give you a chance before a wrap up. Where is Glorona Móna headed now? Like, there's an amazing history that you've talked about. It is ongoing. It's a living history. What do you see as the future for Glorona Móna?
Well, we're at a very exciting time, David. We, as I mentioned earlier, we have ambitious plans in terms of an expansion on a capital space that we have. So, any guys that are listening to this, the US or anywhere else, is more than welcome. As you mentioned, David, we're an open door policy where we like to bring in people in and show them around. We're in a very small building. So tonight we launched our Irish language classes, for instance, for adults. We have to do that in a nearby school because our building isn't big enough to host them. We have already a number of projects that are kind of crammed into a small building. So we have ambitious plans to expand on that. Unfortunately, we haven't got the requisite support from the statutory bodies. So we've had to do a lot of the fundraising ourselves on this. We'll be recently launching a buy a brick campaign, which is going to allow people of modest means and people of not so modest means, I suppose, to contribute to that campaign and to become stakeholders, if you like, in the vision and the future of Glorona Móna. Because I suppose what we're ambitious about is our young people. We're ambitious for our community. All of this is motivated or predicated on the very basic and simple principle that our people in Ballymurphy, the people in West Belfast, are entitled to the very best, just like everyone is everywhere. They are entitled to the best services. They're entitled to the best community centres. They're entitled to the best community infrastructure, and we're determined to deliver it. And we're determined to deliver it where they stand here in Ballymurphy and in West Belfast. So that's a lot of our focus for the next period is going to be on realising the vision of Creana Carriga. That's the name of our capital project. And we're very excited to bring this message to our comrades in the States and other parts of the world. We're looking at kind of models, some of the philanthropic models and fundraising models, which will allow other people to maybe contribute to making this vision a reality. So keep an eye on our website, keep an eye on our socials, keep an eye on the press that we put out. We're going to be launching these campaigns in the next month or two, and there'll be a way for people of like-minded folks from around the world to help us with this. And as I mentioned, we have a number of resources on our website. People can go and dig into this stuff more themselves. They can look at some of the joyful festivals that you talked about where we're bringing the community together, and they can actually become part of this. So please feel free to reach out to us at any time.
Look at here, y'all. I got to tell you, the themes of solidarity, resilience, hope, political education. If they can do it in West Belfast under the boot of the colonization and imperialism, we can damn sure do it right here. I want to thank Feargal. I want to thank Ciarán. Feargal, I'm going to have you back on when this next part kicks off. We'll figure out that tech end. In the meantime, I want to let y'all know that this September 25th, we're going to do a deep dive on Trump, I Do Mind Dying, Lessons for U.S. Cities from the Military Occupation from the North of Ireland. We'll have Kali Akuno, Edgar Batru, and others from the U.S. in conversation with Irish Republican and civil rights activists there to help us think through how to respond to the horrific claims or moves that Trump is doing with troops coming into our streets, the military occupation from the communities in the north of Ireland. They know what to do. This is sponsored by the People's Network for Land and Liberation, Glór na Móna, Trademark Belfast, the Democracy Collaborative, and Democracy at Work. So, folks, you can join us live on this very platform. Shane, would you drop into the chat the Eventbrite where people can know how to come and join us? In the meantime, I want to invite y'all to join us next Monday, September 29th. We'll be joined by two of the young activists and community organizers that we've been talking about from Glór na Móna, Ewan and Emer, who are both just amazing human beings, not just as young people. I mean, they're activists and organizers of the first order, period, end of story. And when you find out how young they are, I reckon y'all are going to be as inspired and impressed as I was. In the meantime, I want to thank, again, Feargal and Ciarán for coming on. Keep on keeping on. Can't stop, won't stop. Peace, y'all.